Welcome to episode 4 of the A Storm of Swords reread. In today's video, we're going to be doing Arya 1, A Storm of Swords. And I think this chapter falls into the same trap I feel like a lot of early book chapters do with George R.R. Martin's work, where they're kind of catch-up chapters. Now, it's interesting because Jaime, in his first chapter, the second chapter of the entire book, but what's so interesting about Jaime's chapter, for instance, compared to Catelyn and Arya's, is Jaime's, I think, has a nice bit of introduction into his storyline of the characters that are involved, a good amount of foreshadowing, and also some action. Whereas I think Catelyn and Arya's first chapter are very much, okay, let's remind the audience what happened in A Clash of Kings. We get a little bit of establishing what to kind of expect from these POVs. And so Arya, I think, starts A Storm of Swords, and you can understand why I think she's kind of controversial in book 3. I think some people love Arya in A Storm of Swords. I'm one of those people that tends to really like her storyline in the first 3 books, but there's a lot of other people that kind of view her almost how I view some of the Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragon point of views, where there's a lot of journeying around, and this first chapter in A Storm of Swords kind of starts that. Like, not much happens in this chapter outside of Arya and co are wandering around, and then you get a really cool moment at the very end. So without me blabbering on anymore, I do want to say if you enjoy these rereads, they will be coming out every Tuesday at 7 p.m. US Central Time, so feel free to subscribe, like, all that stuff so you don't miss an episode. And let's get into page 35 of A Storm of Swords. The night is dark and rainy as Arya leads them north, the weather masking the sound of their escape as she rides fast along a rough road into the woods, with Gendry and Hot PIe struggling to keep up, as wolves howl in distance and the group remains silent as Arya keeps checking behind them for pursuit. She knows they will be chased after stealing horses, supplies, and weapons, and killing a guard to escape. So let's just do a little bit of a catch-up, because this is what this first chapter is. Arya, Gendry, Hot PIe, they've all escaped Harrenhal with one of my favorite chapters of A Clash of Kings in Arya's last one, and at this point, they should be being hunted, which we know they are based on the end of this chapter. I think what works with this chapter is a lot of Arya's paranoia, and she's not showing it. For instance, to Gendry and Hot PIe, she's being like this leader. She's being what leaders have to be. They can never show weakness or indecisiveness. It's a lot of what Robb learned in the first book. And so Arya is showing that here, even though she's being kind of consumed by fear. That's the reason she's, throughout this chapter, not going to let them stop or take a break, because she's scared that these men are going to come after them and do worse than killing them, torturing them, then killing them. And so I think that part of it works nicely as Arya and co are trying to somehow navigate the Riverlands when none of them are really great at that. Arya is the most skilled because she can read and she has been to the Riverlands before. But for instance, Gendry and Hot PIe grew up in a city. They're not used to this at all, and especially riding horses for long periods of time. It's a nice reflection into Daenerys in the first book, where she struggled with Dothraki culture of riding all the time. It's similar to what like Hot PIe and Gendry are experiencing here, because Arya has ridden horses for a while. She knows what it's like. Arya then reflects on how she used Jaqen's coin to trick the guard before killing him, and she anticipates the alarm being raised once the body is found and their absence is discovered. She knows that Roose Bolton himself will not pursue them, but will calmly give orders from safety. Arya expects the hunt to be led by Walton Steelshanks or possibly Vargo Hoat and the brave companions. She thinks of the Bloody Mummers' cruelty, especially their habit of mutilating those who anger them. And honestly, for Arya, I think she is a little bit overcompensating the idea that how important really are they? Because obviously some of these really high officials are not going to come after them. It's going to be kind of like their minions, quote unquote. So I think with Arya, she's, over-evaluating a little bit. But I think that's some of the paranoia, the fact that you're going to have a lot of people hunting you down. And the other thing is likely Arya and Hot PIe and Gendry missing and the things that they took being discovered is probably not going to happen until like morning, until the guard's body is found and you know who did it. And like that's going to take a while for them to investigate. So Arya and her party do have like a good amount of leeway of time. But here's the problem. You have the brave companions who know the surrounding area a lot better than Arya and her companions do. So that'll get us into page 36. Arya knows the consequences if they're caught: mutilation by Vargo Hoat, and worse under Roose Bolton. She is still wearing Bolton's sigil, a reminder of where she escaped from, as she keeps expecting to see torches behind them, but Harrenhal remains dark and silent. It's almost like this ominous presence in the background as you're getting further away from it, but it's still lingering. And again, I think what's great about this chapter is the paranoia. The way that George characterizes Arya in a fairly meaningless chapter in terms of they're just journeying. I think that is what holds this chapter above chapters like, for instance, later on, we're going to get a lot of travel chapters with, characters like Quentyn or Tyrion in A Dance with Dragons, or some of Brienne's early chapters in A Feast for Crows, or Samwell Tarly. The one thing that's different is Arya, to me, is just such a great character. It also helps she's in Westeros, and I just find Westeros to be far more compelling than Essos in the way George writes it. Arya then, to avoid being tracked, leads them off the road and through a stream to break their scent. She believes the roads are too dangerous and chooses rough terrain instead, as Gendry and Hot PIe follow her without question, with Hot PIe especially frightened after witnessing her kill someone. Arya accepts his fear as useful, believing it will keep him obedient. And this is one thing that I really want to point out that the book does well and the show does poorly. In the book, as we read Arya, we're supposed to be looking at this 10-year-old girl, because that's how old she is right now, and going, this is a horrifying path that she's going down. She's being consumed by revenge. She is killing people. She's going to become a faceless man. All of the trauma and her past experiences are leading her down a very dark path. And this line in her head perfectly represents that. She's using fear to keep Hot PIe in line. Could you imagine Arya doing that in the first book? The show almost always glamorizes Arya and her revenge arc, and especially in the later seasons. They still do it in the early seasons, don't get me wrong, but it's much worse in the later seasons. And I think that's just something I always want to point out, because it became much more apparent as I was reading the second book while also doing some show content with Arya specifically, that they really, I think, misunderstood the way George wrote the character even early on. Despite Arya's situation, she feels calmer than she did in Harrenhal, even at only 10 years old. Armed and moving through the wilderness, she feels a sense of control and strength. As she repeats Syrio Forel's lesson, fear cuts deeper than swords. And a lot of this is great because it is based off of what she's experienced in the second book. The second book, she was completely broken down to where she felt like she was not in control of her life at all, that she was just insignificant. And throughout that book, what makes her arc so strong is now by the time we've gotten to book 3, she has a lot more confidence. She is somebody that is a lot calmer while also being faced with a lot of fear and paranoia. So I think it's a great arc to kind of redefine who is Arya as we're moving into the third book. The rain comes and goes as they travel slowly through the dark and difficult terrain, as Arya avoids roads guiding them through hills, brush, and gullies to stay hidden. As the journey is hard and dangerous with poor visibility and uneven ground, but she keeps them moving forward. And I really thought about the Lord of the Rings when I read this chapter. I don't know why, because it just kind of feels a lot like Fellowship of the Ring. And in Fellowship of the Ring, there's a lot of this. Some people love the Lord of the Rings. I'd say most people love the Lord of the Rings books, but I would say as we're getting more modern, I think people are not looking as fondly on the books, but because of the movies, people really love it. I don't know. I am trying to understand the argument of people that don't like the books. I love the books. Fellowship of the Ring is my favorite book of all time, but that's besides the point. But what I'm trying to say is with the Fellowship of the Ring book, it feels a lot like this. You have this journeying, and it's a lot of times off the beaten road because you have your main characters being hunted, and it's some of that which I really love. And I think that this chapter actually does a very good job almost mimicking that feeling you kind of get in Fellowship. But getting into page 37, Gendry is thrown when his horse slips, but quickly remounts, showing his determination as they encounter wolves feeding on a dead fawn, as Arya carefully backs them away to avoid danger. As we also see Hot PIe and his horse go basically fleeing away from the scene. And I really think what George is trying to establish, obviously, is, for one, they obviously can't take the roads. They're being watched by Bolton men. You then have the Brotherhood Without Banners, remnants of the Lannister men at this point. you can't take where everyone is expecting people to go. And when you do that, the problem becomes, how do you navigate the landscape? Even if you have a map, it doesn't help you when you're trying to head north, and let's say you have to head west because there's a lot of difficult terrain that you can't get through, but then you get lost in doing so because you're not sure how far west you went. It's so interesting because nowadays we look at it and we go, oh, we have Google Maps. We can find out where we need to go based on our phones. Go back not even that long ago and people were relying on paper maps. And you might run into the same thing. I think paper maps, with highways is still better than like this, where you have a map and you're in the forest and stuff. But either way, you kind of get the point of like, this would be very difficult to try and navigate when you're 10. And you've almost never been in the Riverlands outside of one small trip coming south. While also having companions who have basically been city boys their entire lives. So it's not the best odds that you're going to get away from these hunters, is kind of what George is trying to establish and the issues this party is having. Also some good foreshadowing to the end of the chapter where we'll see Nymeria's wolf pack. After the encounter with the wolves, Arya is forced to chase down Hot PIe through the trees as they later pass through a burned village filled with destruction and hanging corpses, as Hot PIe begins praying in fear while Arya recites her own list of names, adding enemies to her prayer. It's just showing what was established in the second book of the Riverlands is in chaos and seeing the horrors that have come from this war. She ends with Valar Morghulis touching Jaqen's coin, then casually eating a rotten apple from the trees. I might be reading really far into this a little bit, but I almost feel like George might be looking at a reflection of Arya. Like the innocence of the person is now kind of corrupted with the things that she's had to do, of the circumstances she's been placed in, that she's losing that person she was. And don't get me wrong, Arya's not a villain or anything. She's not like that. But she is somebody that is becoming more and more complex as these books go on, because she is somebody that's been forced to murder someone. Like, yeah, she was being forced as a hostage at Harrenhal, but the guard she killed had nothing to do with that. He was somebody that unfortunately was guarding the wrong thing at the wrong time. So it does get into that. Like, okay, who is Arya at this point? How is she as a character? Can you justify the things she's doing? And that's going to be something that's really gets interesting as we get into specifically book 4 and book 5. But dawn comes without sunlight, the world turning from black to gray under heavy skies. They stop briefly to rest, water the horses, and eat stolen bread and cheese. And one thing I really love about the description, again, it just reminds me so much of Fellowship of the Ring, the way George is able to write the atmosphere for us to almost be inside the characters' heads. I really like that the idea that we're kind of at the point of the story where it's not like it goes from the black of night to now day, it goes to gray. And that to me is so, I think, appropriate for the book we're in, where it is a lot of raining for the most part. It is a lot of sadness. It is a lot of big plot twists and moments that damage our characters or kill some of them. I think it reflects nicely on this book. Gendry then asks where they are going, and Arya simply responds with north. When questioned how she knows direction without the sun, she explains using moss on trees, as Arya reveals their destination is the Trident, showing them on the stolen map. She plans to follow the river upstream to Riverrun, but Hot PIe struggles to understand the map. He doesn't know where Riverrun is because he can't read. And Arya then points out Riverrun's location for him. And all of this has got to be very suspicious for Hot PIe, because why would Arya want them specifically to go to Riverrun? What's so safe about that place? Why not go to King's Landing? Why not head to the Reach? Why not head to like any of these number of places? Why is it specifically Riverrun? And then also, how does she know where it is on this map? So I think that's interesting to point out the idea that, like, still in the books, Hot PIe does not know who Arya is. He might have some inclination that she's not what she was presented as like this orphan boy like them, but he doesn't know who she is like, say, Gendry does. Gendry knows who she is. So I think that's some nice just character writing to just kind of remember, guys, Hot PIe doesn't know who Arya is, as we get into page 38. Another thing I do want to point out before we dive further into this page is that it's also easy to look at a map and go, oh, we've just got to do this. Like, if you've ever been hiking, if you've ever, I would say, just been in nature without the use of your phone to like just check where you are, if you've ever gotten even like semi-lost, like not lost to the extent of like, oh, you don't know where you are, you've gone off the path, you're actually in a bad situation. I'm just saying like, okay, maybe you're on this path, but you're not exactly sure, like, are you on the right path, or how far is it till the exit? Like, think about that from the perspective of Arya in this situation where all you have is a map. There aren't like roads, for instance. There aren't like buildings. There are, but like they're burnt to a crisp. There's not a really great way of telling where you are besides bodies of water. Roads people can travel on, but remember, Arya and their party are not taking roads. And even the rivers, there's tons of rivers. They're in the Riverlands. So it's very hard to pinpoint where you are. And if you mess up one thing, you could end up in a completely different location. And that's the one thing that Arya is going to have to struggle with is it seems simple. It seems simple to go, hey, we need to head straight north, and we also need to reach the Trident, which then the Trident we can follow and get to Riverrun. It seems simple. On paper, anyway, as Arya is going to figure out that's not really the case. But continuing on, Hot PIe is amazed that Arya can read, seeing it as something almost magical. That's another great thing that George does here is reading is very much a privilege. It is something that, for the most part, not all the time, but for the most part, that is something that only the nobility, the upper class, the educated can do, especially in King's Landing. I mean, the percentage of people in King's Landing that can read is extremely low. I think one thing that A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms did quite well in like that flashback sequence in episode 5 is kind of just showing this. Like, what does the average, person in King's Landing, especially in like Flea Bottom, what is their life like? So I think that was a good representation overall of what someone like maybe Hot PIe or Gendry, well, I think their situations are a bit different, but somebody that grew up in King's Landing might have felt like. But even put this into perspective, like Hot PIe is not growing up in complete poverty. His mother was a baker, and then Gendry was also an apprentice, so he was also living fairly decently considering what most people in King's Landing would have lived with, and they're not educated. And they're not like the lowest of the low, so just take that as you will. Arya then tells Hot PIe they'll be safe at Riverrun, but avoids revealing her true connection to it, as Arya keeps her identity secret, trusting Gendry more since he has his own hidden past. And the other thing is with Hot PIe is he's shown himself to not be as reliable. Like, if they are caught, Hot PIe might just give up Arya because he believes that's the best way to save his own skin. Like, Hot PIe is not the most trustworthy person necessarily, whereas like Gendry, you kind of know is. And so that's another thing I think in Arya's mind. Arya pushes them to move faster, urging the horses to trot or gallop when possible. The terrain becomes even more difficult, forcing them through hills, valleys, and dense woods, as Arya takes precautions to avoid pursuit, doubling back at times to try and confuse their trails. She worries they are moving too slowly and fears they will be caught. Again, there's a lot of paranoia here, but in a lot of ways it's caution, trying to mess up the trail, but in reality, seasoned hunters, is that going to stop them? And their pace, again, they're not seasoned riders either. Outside of Arya, the other two have no experience really with riding on horses for prolonged time. Even when they were leaving King's Landing with Yoren, they weren't on horses. Like, the horses they have are actually, good bred horses that the Bolton men have. But at this, Arya then sees what she believed was like some riders, some people behind them, but she mistakes them as they are wolves in the distance. Again, showing some of her paranoia, but also foreshadowing the end of this chapter with Nymeria's wolf pack that seems almost being drawn to Arya. She howls at them, and when one answers, the sound unsettles her. By midday, Hot PIe complains of pain and exhaustion, saying he might fall from his horse, as Arya and Gendry warn him that falling behind would mean death, likely by wolves. They kind of joke with him, but it gets the point across. If you stop now, likely the wolves that have been kind of stalking us for the last few days, and possibly being killed or tortured and then killed, it's not looking great for you, Hot PIe. You better keep going. But this does get Hot PIe to keep going, and as the rain returns, the weather grows colder as mist spreads across the land as they press on. And now it's getting worse. You're in the wilderness, it's getting colder, the mist is probably making it harder to see overall, but they must continue as we get into page 39. Arya then notices Gendry struggling to ride but refusing to complain, realizing neither he nor Hot PIe are skilled horsemen, as I've talked about multiple times, so I won't harp on it too much. Arya knows she can move faster alone, but refuses to abandon them, seeing them as her only remaining friends. And that's really all Arya has left. I mean, she started the series with having a lot of people, her family, and slowly her family has been picked off or they've been separated. Now she doesn't even have her family at all, and the people that she was friends with are growing smaller and smaller. And this is a trend that's not going to stop for Arya. Arya is going to lose both Gendry and Hot PIe in this book, and the one companion she makes in the Hound, it's kind of a complex relationship, and then even by the end of this book, she'll lose the Hound as well. So Arya eventually, and what I think the first 3 books are telling, is the story of her losing basically everyone, and that turns her then to going to Braavos, the Faceless Men. A lot of that is, I think, foreshadowed very nicely in this opening chapter. Either way, Arya feels responsible for their danger since they escaped because of her. She did push them to escape. It wasn't necessarily their decisions, more of Arya pushing them. She considers revealing her identity if captured to try to protect them, though she doubts it would help. Another thing I want to point out is, remember, Arya actually lies to Gendry to get him to go. You know, Arya kind of embellishes some things and makes threats that, everybody's going to lose like their hands or their feet or something. I can't remember exactly what the lie is in book 2, but just know that Arya lied to Gendry to get him to leave Harrenhal, even if it was for the right reasons. So Gendry being here and his life being at risk is also probably weighing on Arya's conscience. But even with Arya and thinking that maybe she could rely on her identity, she doesn't really want to reveal that she is Arya Stark, because she doesn't really trust that Roose Bolton, even though he's sworn to Robb, would actually help them or anything like that. And it's great insight from George to show that, Roose Bolton's not somebody we should trust. And we've only spent, I think, basically 1 chapter and then a little bit of her 9th chapter in A Clash of Kings with Roose Bolton, and already Arya's picked up that vibe. It's really nice foreshadowing here from George. She silently vows she won't let them be taken, gripping the sword Gendry gave her. But by late afternoon, they reach a river, and Hot PIe excitedly believes it is the Trident. Arya doubts this, noting the river is too small and they haven't traveled far enough. As Hot PIe insists they must have come a long way after riding all day, but Arya checks the map and realizes they are still close to Harrenhal. She explains the Trident is still days away and identifies the river as one of the smaller ones, possibly the Little Willow, as Hot PIe struggles to understand, pointing out that the river doesn't seem small to him. And that's the thing, remember, Hot PIe, he hasn't been out in the world. He doesn't know how big the world truly is. This is something the Game of Thrones seasons really screwed up and made the world feel so small. I think House of the Dragon has this problem, but to a different extent. There's teleporting with Game of Thrones, which makes the world feel small in Game of Thrones. House of the Dragon, it's just because of the point of views of the story, it feels kind of like a small conflict. Here, you've got to remember, say for instance, somebody commented this on my Season 8 video on my main channel, the idea of the Hound and Arya going on their horses all the way south is a journey that would have taken a long time with going on the road. Now think about it with Arya and her party. They're trying to not even use the road, going through difficult terrain. It's going to take a while. And unfortunately for Hot PIe, he's realizing he's going to have to be in the saddle for a lot longer. As we get into page 40. Gendry then studies the map and realizes that the rivers connect, meaning choosing the wrong direction could lead them back to Harrenhal. He explains that if it's the wrong river, following it downstream could take them straight back to danger. And that's the issue. So they're arguing over which river this is, and then if it is the river they think it is, well, if it's not that river, then we might be screwed. So if it is the river Arya thinks it is, it should lead them back to the right river that gets them to the Trident, and then they can follow that to Riverrun. If it's the wrong one, and they might be in the wrong direction, they might end up going in a circle back to Harrenhal. And that's the issue you run into, is you just don't know necessarily where you are. At this, Hot PIe panics at the thought of returning and being caught, but Gendry insists they must identify the right river. But Arya decides they don't have time. Arya knows that they don't have all this time to scout the river and spend days, because one, they also don't have the rations to do this. They are being hunted. They've got to figure out a way now. And Arya, not being indecisive, chooses a route. She, in a lot of ways, is kind of very similar to Robb. as he comes into his own at the end of a Game of Thrones. She chooses to keep heading north and cross the river instead of following him, as Hot PIe worries about the depth and dangers like snakes, while Gendry questions if they're even going in the right direction. Arya tries to rely on natural signs like moss, but admits they could be wrong. Arya doesn't really know. Arya is very unsure, but she's putting on a confident face, and that's enough. It gets Gendry and Hot PIe to follow her. But despite uncertainty, she pushes forward, telling them to follow or stay behind. After searching along the bank, she finds a crossing point and forces her reluctant horse into the water. The current is strong and deep, soaking her, but she makes it across. Gendry and Hot PIe follow, struggling, but managing to reach the other side. As Arya confirms, the river was definitely not the Trident, because they cross another river that's even easier, which also isn't the Trident, and they continue on without argument, as we get into page 41. As dusk falls, they stop briefly to rest and eat, with Hot PIe complaining about being cold, wet, and wanting a fire. But obviously, you can't light a fire. You're being actively pursued. You're only like a day or two away from Harrenhal, and again, with their progress of them going on difficult terrain, they're not even like technically 2 days ride from Harrenhal, because if you're using a road, you'd be able to travel a lot quicker. So they're more like a day and a half lead. Let's just give them that. So at this point, you obviously can't do a fire. You're not far enough away yet. Like if you were maybe a week out of Harrenhal, that's when I'd start being like, maybe. But even then, the Riverlands are full of people that are preying on people lighting fires. So it's just a bad idea in general. And unfortunately for Hot PIe, he's definitely missing Harrenhal, at least to the extent of having some pleasure, I guess. Weird thing to say about Harrenhal, but for somebody like Hot PIe, who has never really experienced living outside of with Yoren's party, it's gotta be eye-opening. Hot PIe then asks to sleep, but Arya insists they must keep moving to avoid being caught. Despite her determination, Arya begins to feel overwhelmed as exhaustion continues into the dark. She fears what will happen if they're caught, imagining the brutality of their pursuers. At this point, Arya is trying to fight the sleep that she knows she needs. The only thing keeping her going right now is fear. That idea that if she is caught, there's going to be worse things than sleeping. You can sleep when you're in safety. I think that's what Arya is thinking, but unfortunately, you can't keep going like this. You're going to have to take a rest at some point. As Arya fights sleep, she forces herself to stay awake, but eventually dozes off while riding. When she wakes, Gendry tells her that she had been asleep for a while and her horse had stopped. As he reveals, Hot PIe had already fell off his horse and is now asleep on the ground. As Gendry insists they need to stop and rest, offering to take the first watch. Arya resists at first, but is clearly exhausted while Hot PIe is already asleep, clutching cheese. The man is sleeping with his cheese. Fair play, I guess. As we get into page 42, Arya knows that she does need sleep. I mean, there's no good of traveling at night. You can't see that well. If you lose a horse or something like that, that person is just screwed. They're going to die at some point. There's no point continuing on like this. You do need to stop. And at that, we're going to get probably the best part of this chapter. I'd say it's one of the better parts of the first 4 chapters, even if I have this as my lowest rated chapter, the first 4. But yeah, let's continue on. Arya then accepts they must stop, trusting their pursuers will also need to rest. Exhausted, she barely manages to dismount and prepares before lying beneath a tree. She longs for a bed, warmth, and safety, but keeps her sword beside her as she sleeps. She whispers her lists of names before drifting off, holding on to her need for that vengeance. And it's interesting because as she falls asleep wanting vengeance and all of that, her dream then turns to be very violent, as she then wargs into Nymeria. And this was awesome. I remember reading this section because, again, I had watched the show up until I think the end of season 4. Like, in between season 4 and season 5 is when I read the books for the first time. And I remember reading this and I was like, whoa, this is awesome. Why wasn't this in the show? Arya is actually able to do warging powers. It's kind of the same idea with like Jon. He also can't do that in the show, but for Arya, it's like, whoa, this is super cool. And so here's what we get. As she begins to dream, Her dream is filled with the bloody mummers hunting her. In the dream, she is not a girl, but a powerful wolf leading a pack. As the hunters become the hunted, as she and the wolves ambush them. The fight is quick and brutal, with the wolves tearing through the men. Most of the attackers are killed, easily overwhelmed by the pack. But one man fights fiercely, killing wolves and standing his ground. Arya, as Nymeria, leaps at him in fury and tears his arm off. The dream is savage and triumphant, filled with blood, violence, and a sense of power. In a lot of ways, it's interesting because Arya, after escaping Harrenhal, that's then, as she's regained her confidence, as she's regained being a Stark herself, that's when she starts having these dreams. It's interesting that, like, Harrenhal is this place that we believe is very magical. It gives dreams. It has all this stuff that House of the Dragon, I think, has somewhat done a good job of outside of certain things. It's interesting that that has a direct correlation with Arya now dreaming, at least a lot more, like having a lot more control in this dream. Like even Arya in the dream, or I shouldn't even say dream, it's her warging into Nymeria, she recognizes some of the people that are here. Like she knows who they are. She knows that like she is not just straight up Nymeria. That is a very strong connection, and that makes Arya very powerful in that regard. And so basically, she kills the people that were hunting her down. It was some bloody mummers that were coming after them. And it's a really awesome end to the chapter because it does give you a little bit of like that action. It does, feel rewarding after going through this whole chapter of just, it's a travel chapter. It's what it is. And it's a travel and it's a catch-up chapter. And so as we, end the chapter here, I think the one weakness of this chapter obviously is, on a reread specifically, these are kind of some of those chapters that just like, it almost feels like you want to skip over them because, nothing really happens in this chapter. Outside of the very end, like the very last page is like the crucial part. Like the rest of this, like, it's nice. It's a very, enjoyable, you're just sitting down. It's, it's an adventure chapter, but like, there's not a whole lot happening that affects the rest of the story. It kind of feels like a chapter that's like, yeah, it's essential because you do need that catch up and you do need to understand where Arya's story is going. But it's also like one of those chapters that not much happens. It doesn't, forward the plot all that much outside of the fact that Arya has now basically escaped her pursuit from the Boltons and the Bloody Mummers and all that. So again, I don't think it's a bad chapter by any means. I don't want you guys to take that away from what I'm saying. I just mean in terms of like, when you look at A Song of Ice and Fire and all these chapters are amazing for the most part, it is a slower chapter. And this is one of those chapters where I think as we get further into this reread, you're going to like kind of go, okay, you know what? I enjoyed that slower pace because once you get to a certain part of this book, chapters like this don't exist anymore. It's just constant, fast pace, payoff after payoff after payoff. And so I would say a solid open for Arya in this journey that she's going to have in this book, but it's not anything crazy. It is, of the first 4 chapters, my lowest rated chapter. I think it's like an 8.8 out of 10 or an 8.9. It's a little bit below Catelyn's first chapter and then the Chet chapter, but we will continue on as we'll also get Tyrion's first chapter. And let me know what you guys think about George's decision to actually give us all 3 of the Riverland plotline characters first before hitting some of the big hitters. Like Tyrion, Daenerys, Jon, they all come after the Riverlands plot. I thought that was interesting, and I do understand that obviously the first half of A Storm of Swords focuses on the Riverlands a lot. A lot of the plot happens in that section of the story. And so yeah, thank you guys all for joining me in episode 4. If you did enjoy, feel free to subscribe, like, comment, all that kind of stuff. And excited for episode 5 next week. Same day, same time, Tuesday, 7 p.m. U.S. Central Time for Tyrion 1. I would say some of the best chapters of the entire series are coming up with Tyrion in this book. And so yeah, thank you guys all for joining, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.